We all have secrets. What is yours? Silent Secrets Audio. Confess in the comments.
The first time I saw the maintenance truck cross the runway, the airport had been closed for almost 3 hours. There was no flight due, no snow-clearing crew on duty, and the only truck authorized to be out there was parked beside me with its engine off. This happened in February of 2018, when I was doing airport maintenance at a small coastal airfield in Labrador. I won't name it because people still work there, and because the official explanation never matched what I saw. On winter nights, there were usually only 2 of us after the last passenger flight left. I handled runway inspections, lighting faults, and basic equipment checks. The other person stayed inside, monitoring the radio and weather instruments. That night, it was just me and a dispatcher named Colin. The temperature was around -26, with blowing snow moving across the runway in thin sheets. Visibility wasn't terrible, but the wind kept erasing my tire tracks within minutes. At 11:40, I completed the final runway inspection and parked our yellow maintenance pickup beside the equipment building. I logged the mileage, returned the keys to the cabinet, and went inside. At 12:17, Colin looked up from the window and asked why I was back on the runway. I thought he was joking. Then I saw the amber beacon moving beyond the glass. A yellow truck was traveling slowly along the centerline, heading toward the far end of the runway. From that distance, it looked exactly like ours. Same rotating light, same box mounted behind the cab, same dark strip along the driver's door. I checked the key cabinet. Our keys were still hanging there. We went outside together. Our truck was where I had left it, already covered in a light layer of snow. Colin called on the airport frequency. Maintenance vehicle on runway 27. Identify yourself. There was no response. He tried again. The truck continued toward the threshold, then turned onto an old service road that hadn't been plowed in weeks. We lost sight of it behind the weather station. The strange part was that the service road didn't go anywhere useful. It ended at a fenced storage area containing retired runway equipment and 2 empty fuel tanks. I started our truck and drove toward it while Colin stayed on the radio. Fresh tracks crossed the runway. They were wider than ours and deeply pressed into the snow, as if the other vehicle was carrying something heavy. The tracks continued down the service road, then stopped beside the fence. They didn't turn around. There was no vehicle parked there. I got out with a flashlight and checked the gate. The padlock was hanging open, but it hadn't been cut. Someone had used a key. Inside the fence, one of the old fuel tanks had been moved several feet from its concrete base. Beneath it was a square steel access cover I had never seen before. I called Colin and asked whether the airport had an underground utility vault. He checked the site drawings and said there was nothing marked in that location. I didn't open it. I went back to the terminal and called our regional supervisor. He sounded annoyed rather than concerned. He told us the tracks were probably from a contractor and said the access cover belonged to an abandoned drainage system. When I asked which contractor had keys to the storage gate, he paused. Then he said he would check in the morning. At 1:05, the runway lights activated by themselves. That airport used pilot-controlled lighting after hours. An incoming aircraft could key its microphone on the frequency to turn the lights on. There was no aircraft on radar, and no one had made a radio call. The lights stayed on for exactly 7 minutes, shut off, then came back at a lower intensity. Colin checked the receiver log. Someone had triggered them locally, using the maintenance override inside the electrical room. The electrical room was attached to our building, about 15 meters down the hall. Its door was locked. My key opened it, but the override switch was already in the on position. On the floor beneath the panel was a trail of wet snow. The prints were from heavy work boots. They came from the exterior emergency door, crossed the room, and stopped at the switch. There were no prints leading back out. We searched every room in the building. There was nowhere for anyone to hide, and the exterior door had an alarm contact that should have appeared on Colin's screen. It hadn't. At that point, we called the RCMP detachment. The officer told us someone would come when road conditions improved. Around 2:00, Colin noticed something wrong with the security cameras. The runway camera showed the yellow truck again, parked near the threshold. But when we looked through the window, there was nothing there. The video timestamp was current. Snow was moving across the image in the same direction as outside. Then a person stepped out from behind the truck. They were wearing airport coveralls with reflective bands and a dark winter hat. Their face was turned away, but the name patch on the chest was visible when they passed close to the camera. It had my last name on it. I owned one set of those coveralls. I was wearing them. The person walked toward a navigation equipment shed near the runway. A few seconds later, the camera feed froze. That shed contained radio components and a secured cabinet used by federal technicians. I had no authorization to enter it. We drove out together, keeping the terminal in sight. The shed door was open. Inside, the cabinet had been emptied. Cables were cut cleanly, and several metal modules were gone. Each one was roughly the size of a suitcase, and expensive enough that theft should have triggered a national investigation. Behind the cabinet, a section of wall had been removed. Through the opening, we could see a narrow utility tunnel running beneath the runway. The tunnel led toward the fenced storage area. That was when headlights appeared on the far service road. 2 vehicles were coming toward us without beacons. Colin told me to drive back to the terminal, but the first vehicle moved across the taxiway and blocked the direct route. I turned onto the runway and accelerated toward the opposite end. The second vehicle followed. They never used the radio. They never flashed their lights. They simply stayed behind us while the wind pushed snow across the pavement. Near the threshold, I shut off our beacon and turned down an unmarked emergency access lane. The other driver continued straight for several seconds before realizing we had left the runway. That gave us enough time to reach the terminal and lock the doors. The vehicles disappeared before police arrived shortly after dawn. Investigators found the tunnel, the missing equipment, tire tracks, and several airport uniforms stored beneath the old fuel tank. They also found copied keys and printed identification cards for employees who had worked at the airport over the previous 10 years. My photograph was on one of them. The official report described it as an attempted equipment theft by unknown individuals. No one explained the duplicate truck. No one explained how they entered the electrical room without triggering the alarm. And no one could explain why the security footage showed me standing beside Colin inside the terminal at the same time another person wearing my name walked across the runway. 3 weeks later, the regional office replaced the cameras and sealed the tunnel. Before they poured concrete into it, one of the contractors found a clipboard near the storage area. It contained runway inspection sheets filled out in my name. The entries went back 11 months. Some were dated on nights I had never